Welcome back to Dr. Pronghorn's Make Along vlog. Today's goal is to get the speedometer. Well, the speedometer works to get the temperature and the fuel gauge working in the old Jeep. Okay, gotta love Jeeps. It turned out the easiest way to get to the speedometer was just to take the whole dashboard apart, and it actually came apart really fast, like less than 10 minutes to unscrew the whole thing. So now I can get into the screws on the top of the speedo and pull it out, and I have to pull it apart to be able to get to the gauges. Right, so on the right hand side is the fuel gauge, and on the left hand side is the temperature gauge, and the power comes in to the fuel gauge here, and then this goes out to the fuel. No, sorry, the red one is the power, and then this pink one, is it pink? Yeah, the pink one goes out to this tank, and then there's a bridge that's supposed to reduce the voltage, and that goes to the temperature gauge, and then this one goes to the engine block temperature sensor. The new gauges I've got don't require the voltage drop, so I'm just going to have to make a regular wire that crosses over between these two. You can see how the odometer works. As the speedometer cable turns, it turns this little gear here, which in turn turns that little gear there, which in turn turns the tenths of a mile on the odometer. And the speedometer works by having these magnets so that as this spins, it drags that wheel around against the spring, and that makes the needle move. There you go. This is going to set aside and be safe while I do the rest of the work. I'm going to take this apart. That means taking out the turn signal arrow light holders. These guys could stay in, but they're kind of loosey-goosey, so I might take them out just not to lose them. And then the gauges have to come out with these little bolts on the back. Okay, now I have to make a jumper wire to go from this terminal to this terminal based on the wiring diagram that's on the website from the place I bought the gauges. So there's my jumper wire. I actually had only had a 10 gauge wire that was red, and I only had 10 gauge ring terminals, so that ended up being a 10 gauge. It doesn't have to be, I don't think, but that's what I used. Not bad. That should all be done. Oh, it's back. These two giant lean bolts hold the window. Moment of truth, let's see how this does. Oh, look at that. I have a fuel gauge at least. Look at that, it's working. I'm getting temperature. So the fuel gauge is sometimes reading accurately, and it's sometimes reading over full, which suggests to me that there's a short in the wire that's connecting when it's reading over full. So I have to figure out where that is at some point, but for now, sometimes I'll get fuel gauge readings and sometimes won't. Temperature gauge is working great. I'm pretty happy. And new windshield wipers, so I can actually see in the rain. So for a year now, almost a year, I've been trying to figure out what's going on with my fuel gauge grounding out. I thought it was a wire problem. It's actually grounding out inside the cluster. So as I push on the back of the gauge, it grounds out and it goes to full. So something is going on where inside the cluster, this stupid gauge is grounding, and that's what's causing the problem. As it vibrates, something happens and it gets grounded. And the temperature gauge has been doing it too lately, so it no longer shows the right temperature all the time. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's not. So the problem fundamentally isn't with the wiring or necessarily with the gauges. The problem is in the way they're installed. I got to figure out how they're grounding out. So I'm pulling the dashboard off this weekend, I guess. Okay, in a time lapse, taking the dashboard apart. We'll see how long it takes. So starting now. Ta-da! It took 13 minutes, but that's in part because I had to run upstairs and grab tools and didn't have all the tools ready. So yeah, 10 to 15 minutes to get the dashboard off. So don't worry about getting the dashboard off on your Jeep. I'm going to take the speedometer head unit over to my workbench and then we'll see what we can do. Okay, so somehow the gauges are grounding out the senders on the body of the speedometer. I need to pull these apart and see where that's happening. Okay, after reviewing the disassembly footage, I'm pretty sure what happened was that the screw that holds the sender bolt down, it's loosened up and allowed this to rotate so it could actually touch and ground out. So the trick is going to be somehow getting all of these on tight enough. What I might ought to do is actually get 2 sets of nuts and use them as lock nuts so that I can make sure this stays locked in place. I'm going to make a trip to the hardware store and get exactly the right washers and backup bolts for these. So let's see if we can add some washers to pull this up more. I think there originally were washers on there. I don't know why I didn't reuse them. And then locking nuts to make sure they don't shift. So hardware store trip next. Okay, so after a couple of trips to the hardware store where I got what I thought were the right nuts, but they had the wrong nuts mixed into the right nut bin, I have finally got 5 more nuts that fit. These are 1032 threads. They're not metric, they're English. And I got washers too. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a wire brush to clean the corrosion off here. I'm going to put electrical tape on the bottom of the cardboard to make sure that there's a seal, it's electrically sealed, and then I'm going to put everything back together and try to get it so that the nuts actually pull things together. If you notice, there's a little knurled area on the bottom of each of the bolts, and if the nut goes all the way down, it'll hit the end of the threads and there's still some space even with the cardboard. I think that's what was letting it walk around and then touch and ground out. So we'll give it a try, put it all together. So I have the fuel gauge in hard, and when I connected the 2 wires and grounded the speedometer, it seemed to read okay. When I pulled on the connector, it did make the fuel gauge move a little bit, but it seemed to be reading okay. So I'm going to try putting lock nuts on and then doing the same thing to the temperature gauge, and we'll put it all back together and see how it goes. Okay, So everything seems to work now. I tested it out in the car, and it seems to be doing okay. It's clear it does need to be grounded properly for it to work, but I think once it's screwed in correctly, that'll do it. Okay, I think I got it all working now. So I'm putting the windshield back up, and I'm going to go take it for a test drive. We're going to get gas and see what happens to the fuel gauge when we do it. All right. After all that work, the gauges do all work now, and it was surprising because it seemed to like take time for the fuel gauge to almost like burn in, because at first it was not reading very well, but now it's gotten so it actually reads really accurately. It's like I really do have 3/4 of a tank of gas. And then the temperature gauge also reads really well now too, so the engine's warmed up and running at good temperature. And then if I run it, you'll see the charging and the oil pressure, but it's loud. So anyway, the result of all of that work is that yes, I can actually tell how much gas I have in the Jeep now, and I know how hot the engine's running, and it runs really well, which is hardly surprising because of all the work I did in that earlier video. So yeah, thanks for watching, and here's some Jeep noise to send us along on our way.